Hello and welcome to this CIH podcast. I'm Rachael Williamson, Director of Policy, Communications and External Affairs at the Chartered Institute of Housing. And today I'm joined by our Nation Directors for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, Callum, Chomczuk, Matt Dix and Justin Cartwright, to discuss the recent spending review and what it means for housing in the UK. And I don't think anyone could have missed the fact that we had a spending review last week, as we'd all been gearing up for it for some time. And CIH, like many in the sector, submitted a detailed evidence submission with a set of asks earlier in the year, and we've been working really hard to influence the outcome right up to the last moment with a mixture of public and private advocacy. We always knew that the package announced would represent a critical moment for housing. A spending decision set the tone for how much investment the Westminster government is willing to make in a given area. And for housing, we were all waiting to see how much they would commit to tackling the housing crisis, from building more affordable and social homes to improving existing ones. So before we get into the detail, let's take some quick reflections from our panel. I wonder if I can ask you what one word you would use to describe what the spending review means for your nation as you understand it. Callum, come to you first.
Thanks, Rachel. I'll go with limiting.
Limiting. Okay. Justin?
I'll go with optimistic.
Optimistic. We were seeing some of our character traits coming through here as well, maybe, aren't we? Matt, what about you?
Unclear.
Unclear. Okay, well, let's hope we might unpack some of it as we look at this over the course of our podcast. So I recognise that I'm sort of the host, but I'm also wearing a hat probably for what the spending review means for housing in England. So I'm just going to give a really, I hope it will be short summary of some of the key housing related announcements that we saw. And for CIH members, you can have a look at the summary that we've put together in our member-only briefing that we put out just after the spending review, where you can read more around what I'll just talk through now. But some of the highlights, certainly as we would see them, we had the government announce a new 10-year affordable homes programme of 39 billion. That's from 2026, and that represents what many have described in terms of impact for England as a transformational level of investment. We'd asked for or called for 39 billion over 5 years when we put our submission in, recognising what it costs through increasing grant to deliver on the scale of the challenge for social housing. And we don't yet know the tenure breakdown for this 39 billion over 10 years. But compared to what we had, that is a significant level of new investment. The government also committed to a new rent settlement of CPI plus 1% over 10 years. And again, previously we'd had 5 years with breaks along the way. And most significantly, I think in this space, government's also committed to consulting on how, rather than if, how to implement social rent convergence, which will help to bring rents in social housing into alignment, which is another thing that we had been calling for. We've seen a recommitment to funding for warmer homes, 13.2 billion, which was a manifesto commitment, and that's as part of the government's Warm Homes Plan. And a commitment to fund energy efficiency measures, heat pumps, solar PV and other low carbon technologies, which is really important in the quality space and thinking about homes fit for the future. And alongside new money for the Affordable Homes Programme, we saw an announcement of 2.5 billion of low interest loans for social housing providers and 4.8 billion in what they're calling financial transactions for private investment into house building, which will be managed by Homes England. And we're waiting for some more detail on that. There was also a new investment of £1 billion for building safety funding, which will be open now to the social housing sector, who previously were not able to access funds, which was really impacting on development and, of course, really difficult for residents affected by that. And a new round of local authority housing fund investment totaling around 950 million. That will support local authorities in England to increase the supply of good quality temporary accommodation, which we all know is in short supply, and 100 million for early interventions to prevent homelessness. And then finally, in terms of some of the things I would want to highlight, because there is more, government also announced an end to the use of hotels to home asylum seekers by the end of this parliament. We've got to wait and see how that's all going to work in practice. And a review also of what's called the Green Book rules, which govern how Treasury spending decisions are made, and we hope might create a bit more flexibility in terms of placemaking. And then actually, having said finally, one more final, worth flagging that government also indicated that it would shortly be publishing its modern industrial strategy and infrastructure strategy. And interestingly as well, some of the way the investment was framed at the spending review was very much in that infrastructure space, and that's one of the things we've been calling for, that investment in housing is recognised as a social infrastructure. So there was lots there to welcome, but as always, there's more things that we'd have asked for than we saw. So one thing we did note that we were disappointed to see was no mention of investment in specialist and supported housing, which continues to face real financial crisis and is an area that does have huge knock-on costs for local authorities and for the NHS when not properly funded. So lots to be grateful for, but as always, things to also continue to advocate for in the coming weeks and months. So that's the kind of overview, and I would encourage people to have a look at our member briefing for some more analysis around it. But let's have a think about what it's going to mean then for the nations, because you've all started off with a few different words, whether that's unclear, feeling optimistic, or feeling that it might be limiting. And of course, when it comes to devolved nation funding, it's all about those famous consequentials and what money, how it reads across, and how governments and the nations will choose how to spend it. So Justin, if I can come to you first, what do you think the main implications of the spending review will be for Northern Ireland?
Yeah, I think, well, first off, it's important, because I'm conscious not all listeners may understand, it's important to think about how funding flows to the devolved nations from the UK spending review. So essentially, we don't get direct line-by-line allocations. As you say, Rachel, we get what's known as Barnett consequentials, and these are population-based share of changes in spending by UK government departments on devolved matters in England. So we kind of get a share of that, and that money then forms part of our overall block grant, which the Northern Ireland Executive and the executives in Scotland and Wales then distribute to its various departments. So from our perspective here, to answer your question, once the block grant arrives, we're really then looking closely at how it's distributed internally. So what we want to see is appropriate allocations made to the Department for Communities and Department for Infrastructure in the main. Why those two? Well, DFC, Department for Communities, is vital for ensuring sufficient revenue funding for critical services like homelessness support, the Supporting People program, which we still retain here, which helps to, vulnerable people to live independently. I mean, these are really the lifeline services that prevent homelessness, which of course is better for people and more affordable than responding to crisis and homelessness once it's happened. On the capital side, again, DFC needs that for new build social housing. And the reason I mentioned Department for Infrastructure is they also need robust allocations for essential water infrastructure projects. Things like ensuring our wastewater systems can cope with new development, which is a specific issue for Northern Ireland because uniquely we don't have water charging here, which is a big gap in revenue spending for DFI to invest in that. So I think to summarise, once it arrives, I mean, on the face of it, it's an increase. We will get a share. It won't meet all of our pressures. Certainly not without changes, but I think what we have is a step in the right direction.
Great, thanks, Justin. That's a really helpful overview. Callum, what about for Scotland?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. So I said limiting, and I guess the initial reaction from the spending review last week was really positive about the increase, and absolutely, you can see from England, it's a real step change, and that's absolutely to be welcomed. But as Justin mentioned, the impact for the devolved nations is about the Barnett consequential. So how does the spending review change what we were expecting? We're making forecasts within government, within the sector, within think tanks. We're estimating what our Barnett consequentials and our capital uplift is going to be year after year, because we have to anticipate the future. And while there was we can talk about there's absolutely a cash terms increase and a kind of real terms increase. The reality is, over the spending review, the reality that uplift is less than we were projecting. So what does that mean? Yes, we're increasing money. That means, yes, we can. Hopefully, the Scottish Government will make decisions that puts more money into social and affordable housing. But it's actually less than we expected. So that does limit. So while there's almost a front loading of the capital Barnett consequential. So there's a slight uptake in the next couple of years. years after, there's less than expected. So what does that mean? Well, it means if we want to build social and affordable housing, let's do it now. And I suppose that is the reality from the government. But there is less over the duration of the spending review period, and I think sometimes the complexity of that can get missed in the largesse of the money that's coming through. So that's why I've said it's limiting, because actually, while there's an initial positive reaction, actually we need to kind of look at that detail, and I think that could undermine and limit what we want to do for affordable and social housing in Scotland. So that's where I am right now, Rachel.
Okay, well, we know never to take no for an answer either, do we? So what we've got now doesn't mean we're not going to go back and make the case for more. Yeah, thanks, Callum. And what about for Wales, Matt?
Well, I said uncertain because I think, as my two colleagues have just outlined, we don't know how the devolved nations are going to spend the consequentials they're going to get. I mean, the first point I said, in terms of how Justin outlined how the Barnett formula distributes money. I mean, the one thing I would say, the perennial debate in Wales is it doesn't take account of need. So you're not taking into account the higher levels of poverty in many parts of Wales and other parts of the devolved nations. You're not taking into account the much older population and the older housing stock. I mean, Wales has got the oldest housing stock in Europe. So exponentially, it's going to cost a heck of a lot more to invest in to bring it up to standard, through retrofit, etc. But in terms of what we got from this spending review, so overall, Wales is going to get about 1.6 billion extra per annum. So we're going to rise to about 23 billion block grant per annum by the end of the spending review period. So 1.4 billion of that is day-to-day revenue spending, and about 200 million is capital. So where's that going to go? So our own sums in terms of what we're preparing for our asks ahead of the Senate elections next year, and from work we carried out with Alma Economics for our Right to Adequate Housing campaign, to provide everyone in Wales with an adequate home. The cost benefit analysis found that we need to build 20,000 more social homes on top of the current 20,000 target in order to meet that goal. So at the moment we're getting about 425 million into social housing grant at a 58% intervention rate for grant, around that, or that's what the aim is. But we worked out, or Alma Economics worked out, we need 625 million per annum to get to that additional 20,000 target. So we're only getting an extra 200 million pounds in capital from the Barnett consequential. So you can see the sums aren't quite working up there. And the other point that's been made by the Wales Governance Centre, which is the sort of key sort of think tank, they're pointing out that even if you spent all of that 1.6 billion consequential on health, it still wouldn't meet the historic growth levels for NHS spending in Wales. So that politically, it's hard to see how a current Labour government, when a Labour government at the other end of the M4 are pushing up health spend, they're going to spend it on anything differently, particularly given that there's a bigger demand on health in Wales because of the older population and industrial illness, etc. So is any of that money, or how much of that money, is going to go to capital grant to support housing? I suppose what I would say is, 1.4 billion in revenue spend, that's day-to-day spending. So hopefully we would want to see at least a sizable chunk of that support going into housing support or going into local government to fund that, particularly because we've got new homelessness legislation going through, which is just going to increase the workload for housing homelessness teams in local authorities. So it's uncertain because we don't know. But given the numbers and given the requirements of the NHS in Wales, how much of it is actually going to go to housing and capital spend in particular?
It's really interesting, and I'll bring Callum and Justin in there, but I mean, housing and health are so intertwined, aren't they? And health really was the winner in the spending review in terms of where the money was going, and obviously housing did well too. So really interesting when we're focusing in today, aren't we, on the numbers around housing? But of course we need to think about health in that context too. But yeah, Callum, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I suppose connecting it much broader, thinking about housing and health, I think the thing that hasn't come up, so Rachel, you helpfully gave a list of some of the changes in the spending review, and they're significant. But where we're missing is something I think affects all of us across the UK, is around local housing allowance. So where's that commitment to unfreeze? Because actually it's wonderful to see a change in England, absolutely. And as Justin, Matt and I are talking about, actually what we want to see is that catalyst to change across the UK, and more ambitious targets and more delivery. But we can't, over the short term, we are continually going to need the use of the private rented sector to meet our housing needs, some of the acute parts of the house, the acute need that is present in the sector. And unfreezing the local housing allowance is going to be absolutely critical to that. So I think the absence of that in the spending review, unless I missed it, but the absence of that in the spending review, I think is a missed opportunity. And back to your point, Rachel, that's the bit where the advocacy can't end. That's the bit we need. We all want to see the private rented sector used appropriately, and there are clearly people housed in there that should be in social housing. We all know that. So it's great we can build more. But until we have enough social homes, we need to use the private rented sector. And that means unfreezing local housing allowance so that people can afford to live in appropriate accommodation in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm focusing a lot on the social and affordable housing is in many respects the winner of a lot of the money that was being found. But if you're renting privately, it takes time for all these new homes to be built, and the reality is rents are going up much faster than wages are, and indeed obviously benefit. So one of the things that we had called for in our submission was exactly that, as you say, Callum, the unfreezing of local housing allowance and just bringing it back into line with the real cost of renting. So that is a point we make in our member briefing. The challenge is that decisions about that are made at the autumn budget. So we can continue to make the case, and we rightly will, but it will be that autumn budget in October, November when we'll see. And the challenge is, of course, as we're all seeing, the wider narrative around trying to save money on the benefit bill. And I know government's keen to stress that those who absolutely can't work for disability reasons and others don't need to worry. But there is a general sense of trying to tighten up, which means taking money away. That's the only way you save money, isn't it? So that is a real concern, I think. There's lots of things happening to try and reform people's experience renting privately. But at the end of the day, the cost is often the real driver of concern, isn't it? And we're seeing a real growing kind of mismatch between the cost of renting and people's experiences of often insecure tenure as well, certainly in England. Justin?
There's also an ongoing debate around the idea of ring fencing money that goes to the devolved nations. That's to say the UK government essentially dictating how certain funds are spent in the devolved nations. So that's a tricky one because I think we have to acknowledge the principle of devolution and the autonomy of executives across Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We have our own government making decisions for our specific contexts. At the same time, that does create some tensions. So things are structured in a certain way in the devolved nations, and yet we're kind of receiving allocations based on spending decisions made primarily for England rather than the sort of needs of the nations, which is the point that Matt spoke to. And that can create kind of pressure to align spending and policy responses. I mean, CIH Northern Ireland's stance on it is nuanced. I think we've said we'd support ring fencing of spend specifically on net zero initiatives, for example, because while the funding mechanism for that can sometimes feel muddled, ultimately recommendations around that come from the Climate Change Committee, which is UK-wide. So there's a strong argument for ensuring that all constituent countries have the necessary resources to meet shared targets and that we're all rowing together around that critical issue. But again, I mean, that still largely depends on the UK government making significant spending decisions in England first. But yeah, there is that ongoing debate around ring fencing.
Yeah, and that whole point about devolution in practice is a really interesting one within England as well, because of course the Labour government is also committed to devolving a lot more to the local level, and that's a whole other piece that we could have a separate podcast on. But I think there's a lot of learning, isn't there, from what's working and not from your perspective in the devolved nations, and then how that would be applied in England. And actually that point around policy making and decisions and investment decisions being made often perhaps with a more of an England focus in the Westminster government, that challenge comes up as well, even within England, with the concerns of people saying, well, actually, a lot of this is about addressing problems in London, for example, and it's not speaking to the rest of the country. And I know, as I understand it, the government's trying to do much more sort of place-based approach, but we've heard, haven't we, different rhetoric at different times, whether we're calling it levelling up or whatever. But the challenge is, as you've rightly said, there are some quite particular problems in different parts of the UK, and quite often the policy framework and the funding is a sort of one-size-fits-all approach, and it's how do you get that to really get the money to where it needs to be, addressing the issues where they are most acute, and of course there never is quite as much money as we would like, and even new money announced takes a while to get out the door, to get the clarity on what it's for, and for it to get the kind of cascade. And now certainly in the Westminster government we're within already, you know, a year into that 5-year parliament, and the clock is very much ticking, isn't it? Matt, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I mean, hypothecating of the block grant would just turn the devolved parliaments into glorified councils effectively, wouldn't it? So I don't think there would be any appetite across the devolved nations. But for me, you know, the big housing story for the spending review, and we kind of knew this was coming from the rhetoric that's been coming out of government, and particularly Angela Rayner, is that we kind of, you know, it's a statement of intent, isn't it? You know, we've moved, you know, they have shifted the narrative away from, you know, the last 20 years where it's been all on demand side, you know, various governments, you know, flexing stamp duty or land transaction tax, as it's called in Wales now, to push demand, you know, and that sort of you know, economic approach, and not really focusing on supply and supply of affordable and social housing in particular. And I think, you know, that's a statement of intent. We're going to increase, you know, record levels of spending, double it. So it's a clear shift, and, you know, to start pumping that amount of money into the system, you know, will it have a longer term impact? You know, will it go beyond the political cycle? Will it sort of effectively force the hand of future governments as well to sort of continue on that road? You know, because if they can get, you know, close to that 100,000 or 150,000 new homes figure, vast majority being affordable, then it will set the scene, won't it? And whether it could, you know, a more philosophical level, take us beyond those boundaries and hardwire it a bit more into our housing system rather than the focus we've had on the demand side. So that would be the big take, you know, at that sort of macro level, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can only imagine what it must be like sitting in the Treasury with ministers and officials trying to work out how you spend limited sums of money. So the fact that they have chosen to you know, I guess, work with the sector, and there's a big challenge for the sector now to deliver on the money that's coming its way. But I think a real recognition of just how much the social housing sector in particular was under pressure and needed some money, serious money, if it was going to move forward. And just the scale of the challenge with how many people are, you know, in insecure housing, and the sort of speed at which that has been growing with rising homelessness and temporary accommodation. So they absolutely did the right thing to respond. But when you've got the kind of global pressures that we can see any government is under at the moment, it's still, you know, there's winners and losers in anything, isn't there? So I think you're absolutely right, Matt. It's a real sign of intent, and it shows how hard the sector has worked to make the case, and it really will make a difference to people's lives. But it doesn't suddenly mean there's a magic wand that means all the issues that we've had go away. It will take time. You've still got to have the people to build the homes, the people to repair them, and obviously as the professional body, we're heavily focused on making sure that housing professionals have the support that they need to be working in the way that they would be expected to, in terms of the sort of the culture, the skills, the values. So there's a huge range of challenges, but very much also opportunities. But we know local government will continue to be under significant pressure, and will no doubt be continuing to make the case when it comes to autumn budget for where more investment is needed. I mean, I was struck, I was at a session the other day, which was a bit of a wrap up on initial reflections on the spending review, and there were a few private sector reps there saying how the investment being put into the affordable homes programme, for example, will really help unlock private funding. And I think that's the key, isn't it? It's all about match funding. It's about putting money into one place that helps generate investment in another, and it's only going to work if everybody works in partnership. But there's a lot of moving pieces, and certainly in England an awful lot of other regulatory changes going on. We've got the planning and infrastructure bill going through at the moment. We've got the renters' rights bill. So it's a bringing together the regulation with the investment to hopefully turn the key on some of the significant changes needed. But I recognise from what you've said, Matt and Callum, that obviously you've both got elections coming up in Scotland and Wales, so you're, you know, right in the mix of thinking about what are your asks from a CIH perspective and with the sector. So it'd be really interesting to think about the tie-in there as well, and how much, you know, things like the rent settlement, so not just money but security of a sort of long-term framing, the fact that we've got a 10-year rent settlement now being committed to with hopefully convergence. I think it's just working out the detail of how that would work. That's going to make a big difference too. It's not just the money, is it? It's the certainty. How do you see that impacting in Wales, Matt?
Well, yeah, I mean, that was the other really interesting bit from our perspective in terms of what was announced in the CSR, the rent settlement. So that 10-year CPI +1. So funny enough, I'm off to meet the cabinet minister after this meeting as part of the stakeholder group that we're talking about rent. So we've been looking at it for about 6 months or no, whether there's any other way of approaching setting the rent regime. And it's difficult in a Wales context because we kind of work in the same marketplace as England in terms of drawing in that cross subsidy. The lenders are cross border, so for us to go markedly different would have could have a significant impact on the sort of confidence of lenders. At the same time, we obviously want to go down the route of trying to make rents more affordable. But we are in that system, and obviously we all know that rent is part of that key triumvirate in building social housing. It's part of that. Rent along with social housing grant, capital funding, and then cross subsidy. That's how we fund the building of social housing in the UK and benefit, obviously, but we won't go and say that for another day. So I think that is really going to influence the Welsh government's decision making over the rent settlement here. It's difficult to see how they move to a markedly different system. So they may go for a shorter period perhaps and then review it after the next Senate election. But that impact is quite significant. I mean, in terms of other priorities, I mean, like I've said, we're saying we want to see a market increase in capital funding for social house building. It's difficult to see within the funding envelope whether it can get to the levels we require, but also the retrofit side of things as well. So 13 odd billion for sort of warmer homes. Yeah. So is that an increase? And politically, can devolved governments say, right, we're not going to increase our investment into retrofit of social housing in particular to bring, make them better in terms of fuel poverty, but also the green agenda. So yeah, it's those are going to be the battlegrounds on housing as we move into the Senate elections, I think.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And it'd be great, Callum and Justin, to get your thoughts on that. I mean, certainly at the England end, we've got an awful lot of regulatory change coming. We've got the Future Home Standard. We've got minimum energy efficiency standards. There's a lot coming for the social housing sector, but also for the private, where, yes, it's good to see there'll be more funding, but there's also the cost of this work is not to be underestimated, is it? But as you say, Matt, this is about guarding against fuel poverty, but also homes fit for the future, both new ones being built, but existing ones too. And we obviously, as you've highlighted, have got some of the oldest housing stock in Europe and particularly challenging in Wales. Callum?
So I guess part of this, it just flags up the differences of devolution settlement. So we don't have a rent settlement in Scotland. Every social landlord in Scotland will set their own rents in consultation with their tenants based on their own operational priorities. And that's really positive, really welcome, something that is an important core part of the sector in Scotland. However, I would say, given that we are introducing a system of rent controls in the private renting sector, I think that is under threat in the future. I think we need to be really mindful of that, because I think it is landlords in consultation with tenants determining their own priorities for rents and services is something we really want to keep a hold of. But I'll put that to one side. The big challenge absolutely is, we're facing an election in Scotland next year. The challenge is supply and homelessness. If we're all, it's the same conversation we've had for decades, and unfortunately we'll probably continue to do so. How do we get more bang at our buck? How can we, when we look at the cost inflation in the construction of homes over the since COVID, You know, they weren't cheap 7 years ago, but it was manageable. Now, the exponential costs in Scotland, it's around between 250 to 300,000 pounds per unit to deliver a kind of social home. I'd imagine it's similar across the rest of the UK. The money that we had set aside at the start of the Parliament is clearly not getting as much, but we've got even greater need, don't we? In Scotland, we've declared a housing emergency. You may not have declared it elsewhere in the UK, but we're dealing with similar contexts. We need to drive more out of the money we have. How do we depress the cost of building a home? And I think fundamentally it comes to land, and it comes to land taxation. And how do we look at that? I think in the UK, we've had models where we've considered this in the past. Different governments have zigged and zagged as they've introduced and removed things that look to address the cost of land. I don't think our collective ambition for building social and affordable homes is always going to be limited by the kind of capital spend we have. So we need to get more out of what we spend, and that means looking at the costs. And I think as we all, as you know, CIH Scotland and our partners will go into the next election, and we're doing some research that will call for a number, and you know, that number will be announced later this year, and we'll call for X number of social and affordable homes. But unless we're willing to grasp the thorny issue about land taxation, I don't think we're ever going to get there. And I think that's true of Scotland as it is across the rest of the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you might have been listening in on conversations Matt and I have been having recently, because this has been a live debate, and this is definitely one where I think we can benefit from our UK-wide knowledge and insights, because this is an issue that, as you say, absolutely kind of crosses all our boundaries, doesn't it, as a huge challenge, but also opportunity if we can get it right. Justin, what are your thoughts?
Similar to Callum. I mean, housing associations in Northern Ireland set their own rent increases. The housing executive rents are set by the Minister for Communities. So I think the big challenge in housing at the moment in that space is making sure that the housing executive rents are at an appropriate level that both facilitates investment as well as affordability for people, because the political, I suppose, impetus is to keep rents low. So I think in that space we've said, look, you know, what we're looking for really is an independent kind of evidence-based rent setting policy that gives people confidence. I think, but affordability of rents overall, less of an issue. I think it's probably partly to do with generous grant rates, which are on average are around about 50% here, a wee bit less than when you have grant rates set at that kind of level. You know, and you've got housing associations keeping an eye on affordability. You know, traditional kind of social heart within a lot of housing associations, you tend to have, you know, rents kept at much more affordable levels. So I guess there's been much less of a push around that. So I think, yes, in terms of what we need, you know, absolutely more capital and revenue for new homes and homelessness services, things like that. But actually, I'd go, you know, a bit further and be a bit more inventive and say, I really think that the Northern Ireland executive needs to exercise more of its power, perhaps make some more controversial decisions. So, for instance, the issue with water charging, you know, we're the only part of the UK where households don't get a bill for water. We actually had a report come out in the last week or two from the Fiscal Council, which is Northern Ireland's budgetary watchdog. And it says additional revenue charging from domestic water charges or other sources appears inescapable if NI Water is to be given the resources necessary to deliver high quality and environmentally sustainable services. So I suppose I'd flag the sustainability of this ongoing political decision to not have water charges. You know, there's certain things that Northern Ireland decides that we don't do. You know, water charging is one of them. You know, we don't do nuclear power on the island, for an instance. So when you're looking at, okay, we're moving towards renewable energy and away from gas and coal. So where's that element of a kind of sustainable, reliable element of overall energy provision that doesn't get us into a situation like apparently happened in Spain, where, you know, there's sort of questions around the, I suppose, the impermanence of renewable energy in the grid, as vital as that is. So just really to flag, you know, we've got tough decisions to make locally, so let's look at them and take unpopular decisions on them. But of course, yes, you know, more capital and revenue resources are absolutely critical too.
Thanks, Justin. And Matt, let's come to you for final thoughts, and I ought to wrap up.
Yeah, I'm just going to reiterate Callum's point. I think that's the nail on the head, isn't it? And it's probably more than just land value capture. It's more innovative and radical ways of bringing in capital finance more generally. Because at a Wales level, our 625 million figure that we're using for those additional 20,000 homes based on a 58% grant intervention rate. Now, currently the average grant intervention rate in Wales is about 70 or 80%. So we can see that we're not drawing in enough cash in order to build the pace and scale we need to. So I think some radical solutions on that. I mean, we may be getting it. It'd be interesting to see what happens with the CPO and the new towns and what that drives. Because I mean, the only land value capture tool we have at the moment is Section 106, and whilst it delivers a fair bit, it doesn't really do what it needs to do. So we need to look at other ways of land value capture to draw in that and also draw in the private finance. And I think fundamentally that's what the CSR is trying to do, isn't it? It's front loading public investment to try and draw in that private capital. And that's what we need to do in the housing sector as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, that's probably a good note on which to start to put it to a close, because I think, as you say, spending review, a 3-year spending review, really helpful to have longer term certainty. But we were never going to get all the money that would be needed from government, and we were never expecting it. So it's all about looking at other ways in which you can find money, get rid of some of the obstacles. So definitely a live debate to continue with around land value capture. Certainly the planning and infrastructure bill that's going through in the Westminster Parliament at the moment is looking at all of those issues, and planning reform, as we've heard, is often pointed to by government as one of the ways in which it's going to seek to address many of the supply challenges. But as I think the conversation we've had today has highlighted, housing doesn't sit in its own sort of it doesn't sit in isolation, does it? It absolutely links across to other agendas around health and certainly decarbonisation and energy security. So no doubt we'll continue having these conversations, but it's been really helpful. I've certainly learned a lot from talking to you, and really interesting to think about how this plays out and how what might have been seen as fantastic news for England actually is still very challenging for the devolved nations when you think about how the consequentials work themselves through. So no shortage of stuff for CIH and the sector to keep advocating for. But thank you for joining us today to help unpack that. So big thank you, Matt, Callum, and Justin, I've not managed to do probably a particularly good job of setting out the case for England whilst also hosting, but people can go away and have a look at our member briefing, which will tell you everything you need to know. We have got some webinars coming up, I know, across the nation, so we'll be looking at this in more detail in terms of investment as well as regulatory development, so do keep an eye out for them on the website. But for now, a big thank you, and tune in for our next podcast, which will be out shortly. Thanks very much.